Well, it's a great pleasure for me to be here today to talk to you about my forthcoming book on Frederick Delius. There's a certain coincidence in some ways. Here I am talking in my office in the music school of Durham University, which came into being in 1946-47 with its first resident professor, Professor Arthur Hutchings. And Hutchings wrote a book on Delius in 1949. Under him was another musicologist called Peter Evans, who then later became my supervisor at Southampton University when I went there in 1980 to work on the music of Sir Hubert Parry. And Peter Evans was a great fan and scholar of British music and had a great interest in the music of Frederick Delius. And in some ways there is that nice sense of passing on the baton or the torch to me. And here I am back in Durham to also write some of my own thoughts on the composer. I began to get to know Delius's music perhaps more closely while I was a music student at Cambridge. But I suppose the lifelong desire was always there to write something about Delius's music when the time was right. So about 5 years ago, that time arrived, and I began to realise that what I wanted to write about Delius was something about the thorny problem which has always existed about his music, and that is its unconventionality. His music is a thorny problem. What to do with it, he doesn't follow particularly traditional structural or tonal procedures in the way that many of his contemporaries did. He was in many ways a stateless composer. He didn't follow the current nationalistic tendencies that many of his contemporaries did. And this made him different. And of course the entirely cosmopolitan side of Delius is a fascinating one. The fact that of course he was born in Bradford of German parents, spoke German at home, in the house at Claremont. He went to America, was highly influenced by his surroundings, the tropical surroundings of Florida. He then, of course, was a student in Leipzig, and then, having returned to England to fight his father, who wanted him to enter the wool business, Delius managed to persuade his friend Grieg to speak up for him, and he ended up then, of course, studying in France, in purely a sort of a situation of self-communion, you might say. And then his career, of course, started up really in the 1890s. And of course, one of the things about Delius then that's always fascinated me is the nature of his education, which he seems to have been very critical about later in life. The nature of the stylistic development of those years in the 1890s. What sort of influences he absorbed, what was really important to him. I'm even particularly interested in the nature of his conservatoire education at Leipzig and what he actually did there. And to see how this possibly reflects on the nature and procedures and advancement of his musical style at a later date. And then, of course, one of the things that I really wanted to try and explore was how Delius deals with the issue of form, tonality, and style. And it's a difficult problem, and my book tries to look at these problems one by one, or at least these questions of how Delius developed as a composer, across his whole creative life, which was really from about 1888 until the early 1930s. And one of the things that has always fascinated me about Delius's time in Florida, of course, he loved the tropical surroundings of Florida, and anybody who's ever been to the St. Johns River and to the site where Delius had his homestead along the banks of the river, you get a tremendous sense of place, you get the sense of temperature, the dawn, the sunshine. This was all, I think, very influential on Delius. But as he always said, he was highly influenced by the sound of the Negroes on the plantation that he was overseeing, that he owned, of course, and the sounds, the romantic sounds of this improvised harmony was hugely influential on him. But of course, much more important as well than these experiences is how Delius's technique began to shape itself. And of course, he always made great store by the fact that he learnt rudimentary music from Thomas Ward. I wanted to explore this a little bit in the opening chapters of my book, because we don't really know quite how much Delius learnt from Ward. I think he was obviously having to try and catch up. Around 1884, 1885, he was into his early 20s. If it had been a music student in England at that time, they would have probably started around about 18 or 19. So he was a late beginner, and he had no technique really to speak of. I mean, he would probably muck around on the piano at home in Bradford and so on. But there was no formal musical education that he'd had. So I think he was obviously extremely grateful to Ward for providing some kind of formative education, learning the rudiments of harmony. Yet we know from the surviving books of exercises that Delius had that he was learning really more complex techniques, invertible counterpoint, canon and so on, when he went to Leipzig. And I think probably the truth is that Delius learnt a lot more at Leipzig than he was prepared to own up to when he was an older man. One also has to remember, I think, that it was really quite fashionable when Delius was older, around the 1920s and 30s, maybe to think that academia and learning your craft through academia and so on and through teachers was actually a trammel to your natural form of expression. Technique and so on, yes, but actually it's inspiration that matters. The only difference is, like anybody who's ever learnt composition, is you need the discipline in order to be able to frame that inspiration. It can't be just unbridled, it has to be harnessed in some way. And Delius's experiences at Leipzig, I think, are really quite important. We can see these in the collections at the British Library, and one book of exercises that is in the Jacksonville University Library in Florida, that Delius went through much of the exercises, the contrapuntal exercises, that his teacher, Solomon Jadazorn, had published. We can see the numbers of the exercises which correspond with the published exercises in Jadazorn's book. He probably read Jadazorn's Formenlehre, a study of form and structure, while he was at Leipzig. And he seems, looking at the kind of attendance that he had, that he put great store about going to Jadazorn for this discipline. And indeed, later Delius always spoke up about the productivity of learning counterpoint. But I think Delius learned a great deal more, not only from the classroom in Leipzig, but what the musical environment of the city provided. After all, it was the home of the Gewandhaus, one of the finest orchestras in Germany at that time. It was also a home to one of the most modern opera houses. After all, the conductors there were Nickisch and a young Gustav Mahler. And Delius, we know, went to operas there all the time. And as much of this was part of his university experience, we might say, and that he heard lots and lots of Wagner. Of course, the other thing that Delius did, which was enormously formative, was to meet one of his gods, Edvard Grieg. Now, he'd been au fait with Grieg's piano music even before he went to Leipzig, and he was probably playing Grieg's piano music on his square piano in the homestead in Florida. But of course, then meeting Grieg in person for the first time was, I think, hugely important. And of course, that coterie of Norwegians in Leipzig, Sinding, and Grieg's wife Nina, they were all, I think, extremely important to him. You put that kind of mélange together of Grieg's inventive and highly innovative harmony and the experimentalism of Wagner's music dramas, particularly Tristan and Isolde, which I think was enormously germane to the formation of Delius's style in the 1890s. And you begin to see, I think, a picture of Delius's style emerging step by step over those 10 years. Just to take one example of an early song. Even that wonderful appoggiatura, that dissonant appoggiatura, is something that Delius developed was beginning to develop even at this early stage. One of the most important works of Delius's early years, which he actually composed at Leipzig, was his reminiscences of Florida. And in Florida, one of the remarkable things is that we already begin to see Delius's penchant for experimental harmony. One of the most remarkable gestures comes at the very beginning of Florida, and of course it's this. And it's Delius's predilection for these use of augmented harmonies, in this case in the last inversion of the augmented sixth, that is already revealing the fact that this sort of harmonic process was something that appealed to him. And of course we see the same thing in Grieg's harmony as well. I've mentioned Delius's interest in Tristan. I think this is an extremely important part in the formation of Delius's chromatic harmony. It's also important, I think, in terms of the kinds of plots that Delius chose for his operas. One of the hugely formative elements of Delius's interest in Norway, and this was particularly after he met Grieg, was the influence of Ibsen. Now, Ibsen, of course, had become really a very famous playwright, but Ibsen's particular type of philosophy, I think, influenced Delius enormously. And it's no accident, of course, that after he'd arrived in Paris in the early 1890s, one of the things he wanted to do was set Ibsen's poem På Viderne. And of course, he does this in, a rather experimental way as a melodrama, not a common genre around that time particularly, although of course Grieg had written his own melodrama, Berglio. It's very interesting, I think, when you look at the scenes of På Viderne, that you not only see the emergence of these horn calls, which of course I think were Delius's memories from things like his experiences in Norway, but also the harmonies of Wagner, and particularly the kind of element of tragedy and redemption in Wagner, which are themes that run through Delius constantly. And it's particularly evident in this little extract towards the end of På Viderne, where we can hear the use of the Tristan chord. There are other examples too of how we can hear Delius's harmony developing in these years of the early 1890s. I think he was actually also rather influenced by the atmosphere that was going on in Paris, with composers like Massenet and Bizet and others who were writing these orchestral suites for the Lamoureux and Cologne concerts. We can see this also in some of the manuscripts where the instrumentation is written out in French. I think this must have really been designed for the French market and possibly even for French publishers. This is a little extract from the Marche Caprice. That mixing of minor and major modes in the harmony is another Delius fingerprint that we'll see exploited again and again in his much later works. One of the things that I have found so fascinating about studying the first part of Delius's compositional formation is that how quickly after Leipzig he developed. After all, he should have been there for 3 years, but in the end he only ended up being there for 2. He was eager to get on, he was impatient. Probably a 3rd year at Leipzig would have done him a lot of good in developing his technique that little bit further. But nevertheless, what he was learning about Wagner and what he was learning about experimental harmony was clearly going in at an extraordinarily rapid rate. He was, of course, still listening to Wagner's operas. He was going to the opera in Paris and so on. And by 1892, of course, he was already well ahead with writing his first opera, Irmelin. And I think one of the extraordinary things about Irmelin is that he'd obviously learnt how to write in the kind of manner of Wagner, in Wagner's form of declamation and leitmotif, very, very quickly indeed, and I think this is particularly remarkable. Irmelin, I think, is very much a neglected work of Delius, and yet it's got so many fingerprints of the later mature composer. Here's one extract. And of course, that very last part we recognise from the very much later Irmelin prelude that Delius wrote a dictation to Fenby in the early 1930s. But of course, it's also a constituent of one of his Danish songs, which he wrote in 1896 and early 1897, I think the Danish songs are enormously influential. In these songs he discovered the literature of Jacobsen, who is also another important figure later on in Delius's output. And in these songs we really see for the first time, I think, that almost total fluency that Delius was developing. At about the same time as Delius was writing his Danish songs, he was also writing his third opera, Coanga. This, I think, is also a highly formative work, in that one of the important elements of Delius's style, which is this music that he'd heard in Florida amongst the black singers on the plantation, appears more potently, more prominently in the musical fabric of the opera. But we also see something else beginning to appear that again becomes a Delius thumbprint later on. That is, I think, what we might call the bifurcation of the kind of harmonic structure that Delius is using. We'll see time and time again Delius using a diatonic melody, a simple melody, as we hear in Brig Fair many years later. What we see is this structural bifurcation of the two elements, chromatic harmony and a diatonic melody. And we can see this in one of the plantation melodies that Delius uses right at the beginning of Coanga. For example, this move towards the cadence there with that chromatic bass will become more and more common in Delius's style later on. And it is this fundamental bifurcation in Delius's harmonic and melodic styles that really, I think, begins to shape Delius's voice thereafter. Coincidentally, I think one of the most interesting things is that Delius may well have been influenced by the sort of experiments that Grieg was doing in his later music as well, and particularly in the 19 Norwegian folk sketches, the Opus 66, short pieces that Grieg wrote, were interestingly published at more or less the same time as Delius was beginning to find himself in this music. And it's very interesting to listen to a little piece called Siri Dola Wiesen, which appears as number 4 in the Opus 66 collection, that Grieg is doing very much the same thing. Just listen to this little extract. Grieg is doing very much the same thing with that. attendant augmented harmonies which harmonise the simple diatonic tune above. So all of these constituent elements were very much coming together in Delius's style during the 1890s, and in my book I give considerable attention to formative pieces such as Coanga, the Danish songs, and also his symphonic poem Over the Hills and Far Away, which of course Beecham greatly admired. I'd like to finish this first part of the exploration with an extract from Over the Hills and Far Away. This is the second subject of Delius's rather unconventional sonata structure, because again you can hear other thumbprints at work here. You've got this inner melody which is played in the violas, and Delius seems to have given quite a lot of his prominent melodies to violas. I can think of Paris, and I can think of Inner Summer Garden many years later. But we've also got this tonic pedal that runs underneath, that underpins the entire harmonic structure. And it's also these added sixth, added ninths, the nature of the chromatic appoggiaturas, all of these as an agglomeration, as an amalgam, I think begin to help us recognise that this music is only by one particular author. That, I think, is a particularly indicative extract of Delius's style beginning to coalesce recognisably. One work which I give particular attention to in the book is a work which I think is one of Delius's finest pieces. I think it's one of his most characteristic, and one where I feel he was working at a white heat. And that was his fourth opera, A Village Romeo and Juliet. And I think I've given a particular place to this, partly, of course, because it gave rise to one of his most famous orchestral essays, The Walk to the Paradise Garden, which is probably still, along with maybe The First Cuckoo in Spring, his best and his most well-known orchestral work. But I think in this, even more than Irmelin or The Magic Fountain or even Coanga, which I think mark out a highly formative route in his working with opera. Delius seems to have found himself in A Village Romeo and Juliet. I think he was clearly inspired by Gottfried Keller's tragic story, and of course it was an ideal subject really for Delius, because in the story where the two lovers who find they cannot marry and they cannot live in the real world together, they decide to drown themselves. There is that element of a kind of Liebestod, a tragic Liebestod, which marries up, I think, with Delius's love of Tristan and Isolde. And there are so many things about this opera that I think show Wagner's influence of Tristan. We can see this particularly in the last section of the last scene, which ends in B major, which is the key of the middle of the second act and its resolution in the last act of Wagner's opera. But there are many other resonances too in the opera which I think are important. One of them is, I think, that the whole panoply, the whole matrix of Delius's leitmotifs, which again he'd clearly learnt how to handle from studying Wagner. And we should remember, by the way, that Delius actually copied out pages from Wagner's scores, clearly by doing so learning the process of Wagner's liquid declamation, you might say, his musical prose, and the contrapuntal nature of the orchestra and the way in which that structure develops into the music drama. And of course we know that Delius revised A Village Romeo and Juliet so that in fact it wasn't an opera in 3 acts any longer, it was a music drama in 6 scenes, or Bilder as the Germans would say. And this is important, I think, because Village Romeo and Juliet, very much like Ermelin and The Magic Fountain, and not unlike Coanga 2, is very much shorter. It's a very much shorter opera, and we know from what Delius said about opera later on in his life, particularly when he was writing his final opera, Fenimore and Gerda, that conciseness was the all-important element in opera for him. There were, he didn't want somebody to take 20 minutes to die, or the whole process that, a dramatic situation took 30 minutes to unravel. For Delius, it will take maybe no more than a couple of minutes. And he believed in this, at the same time making no compromises in the vast orchestral forces and the singers that he required for his opera. And this is no exception in A Village Romeo and Juliet. But one of the things about Village Romeo and Juliet that always impresses me is the sheer fecundity of the musical material and the way in which he develops it through the 6 scenes of the opera. I mean, just take one example, for example, the opening idea. Which is at the very opening of the orchestral prelude to the first scene. Delius later on develops it in a most Tristanesque way later on in the opera. In that highly chromatic fashion, where we can clearly see the influence of Wagner. But then we also see Delius developing his characters, I think, rather more than he'd done so in his 3 earlier operas. One of those, I think, who is most intriguing and most enigmatic is the Dark Fiddler, this son of the town trumpeter, this bastard son, who couldn't somehow inherit the land between Marti and Mantz, and of course is really the root of all the evil and trouble that comes to Wrenchen and Sali later on in the opera. His harmony, of course, often seems to be suggestive of Debussy, though I rather think the whole tone harmony that we hear representing him, I think is perhaps more indebted to Maurice Ravel, who was also experimenting with whole tone harmony at very much the same time, the late 1890s, that Delius was writing this. That could come out of a Debussy piano prelude any day. But actually, at this time, it's really quite probable that Delius didn't know much of Debussy's music at all. It was probably other styles, perhaps that of Ravel, and maybe his friend, who was actually preparing a good deal of his vocal scores of the operas, Florence Schmidt, who were the prime influences at this time. There's no doubt that what Delius discovers in A Village Romeo and Juliet is to handle the orchestra symphonically. One of the most important constituent parts of the opera, perhaps ironically, in A Village Romeo and Juliet, is the role of the orchestra. Now, of course, it had always been the role of the orchestra as a symphonic dimension, as a symphonic vehicle, that had been the main driving force in Wagner's music dramas, The Ring, Tristan, Die Meistersinger, and Parsifal, all works that Delius, of course, knew extremely well. What we tend to find in A Village Romeo and Juliet is large paragraphs of purely orchestral music, where the entire genre of opera, as a vocal art of some kind, begins to change, or we begin to sense some kind of change. And we knew Delius was wanting in some way to change the perception of opera and operatic structure, opera reception. And I think one of the remarkable things about this piece is that we can hear this role of the orchestra being so prominent. There are various parts of the opera, particularly the fourth scene, the last scene with the bargeman and so on, where the orchestra is increasingly dominant as a partner in the operatic structure. One of the marvellous things, of course, is the richness, again, of the material that Delius uses in his opera. I always think this is one of the most beautiful sections in the entire piece, where Sali says to Vrenchen, "Shall we follow these good people," in other words, the vagabonds, "to the mountains?" And of course they had been invited to the mountains to take up a kind of vagabond existence away from society. But of course Vrenchen and Sali decide they cannot, and then they decide, of course, to die together, a la Tristan. Listen to this example. I'd have given both arms to have written that, not just my right. And there are, of course, passages from that which, of course, Delius then, later on, after he'd completed the first version of the opera, involved in the much larger interlude of A Walk to the Paradise Garden. And it's particularly that idea, isn't it? Which is so moving and which we associate with Delius in so many ways, that downbeat of the triplet and so on, and the suspension, which even recalls that very first song which he'd written in much more overt Griegian style at the beginning of his compositional career. The fecundity of A Village Romeo and Juliet which I think really marks the first major maturity of Delius as a composer, I think was then echoed in a work which has not received that much attention in Delius's output, but which I still think shows an extraordinary outburst of inspiration and understanding, again, of how music drama works with the role of the orchestra. Margot Le Rouge, which Delius entered for the Sansonio Prize, and didn't win it, of course, eventually became an idyll in the early 1930s, thanks really to the help of Eric Femby. But Margot Le Rouge is full of extraordinary material. Delius may not have found working in the French language that easy. And certainly within the dimension of verissimo opera, he probably also felt a little bit ill at ease. But Margot Le Rouge has some magnificent music in it. And I think this work actually deserves to be a lot better known. I often feel that this one idea, which is of Lily Béguin, as she is talking about the artiste, Margot's lover, whom she's also in love with, is amongst some of the most beautiful music that Delius ever produced. Delius again at white heat. But of course, one of the things that Village Romeo and Juliet and Margot really started to do was to propel Delius into the business of getting his music performed. Now, of course, one of the most formative elements of Delius's music, being performed for the first time, was his London concert in 1899. Again, in the book, I devote quite a lot of time to this because quite a lot of a number of his important works from his first phase were contained in that concert. Parts of Coanga, the Danish songs, Zarathustra's Mitternachtslied, and so on, which, as we know, created quite an impression amongst the London public, and which Delius then never really properly capitalised on. But for the next few years, Delius had to spend his time really touting his works around, especially in Germany, and not with a great deal of success to start with. It's only really thanks to the help and recognition of Elberfeld's Hans Heym that Delius's works start to get performed. And it's particularly not so much in the opera house, but in the concert room that Delius starts to make his way as a mature composer. And I'm particularly interested in the works that begin this phase. One is, of course, Apalachia, which is one of the most extraordinary hybrid works. In one sense, it's choral. In another sense, it's orchestral and highly influenced, of course, by another enfant terrible of the day, Richard Strauss, whose works, of course, Delius had made it his business to get to know. And we can see that in works like Paris, of course, which precedes Apalachia. But Apalachia is again a bringing together of the music that he'd heard in Florida, the plantation music. We also see Delius exercising his skill in another branch of musical structure in which I think he excelled, and that was variation structure. And variation structure, again, is something that I explore at some length in the book. And this is not only in works like Apalachia, where the whole piece is a series of character variations, but of course later on Delius started to explore variation form in Brig Fair and also in the first dance rhapsody. But this also, I think, had an effect on the way in which he conceived musical development in the very fabric of his music, because many of the ideas that he often comes up with in his musical structures actually undergo a series of musical variations, a whole sort of internal structure going on within the larger one. And I think this is very interesting when you look at works like the Second Dance Rhapsody. You look at sections of even a big choral work like A Mass of Life. In Apalachia, we see much of the same process going on that we see in Coanga, the use of a highly diatonic melody, Of course, what we see, just like in Coanga, is that Delius starts off in a diatonic fashion. The chromaticism starts. We see that same bifurcational process going on between underlying harmony and chromatic bass and diatonic melody. Now, of course, Delius experiments with all sorts of other things in Apalachia, which I think, again, are remarkable. I mean, one of them, I think, is the extraordinary frame to the work, which lies in some ways outside the variation structure. And this is the dawn scene, where people are getting up to go and work on the plantation in this American setting. And Delius produces, again, so much of his added harmony. Again, true Delius with all that added note harmony. And then, of course, he creates this series of characteristic variations around it. I mean, one of the most remarkable, I think, is the minuet variation, which is around number 4, which shows that Delius knew his 18th century music probably just as well as anybody else. Etc. That, of course, is a version of that original plantation song, but dressed up as an 18th century minuet. There are lots of other examples in Apalachia that I could talk about, but we can't really leave Apalachia without the extraordinary appendage at the end of the character variations to the tragic scene at the end where a slave is being sold down the river. Oh, honey, are you going down the river in the morning? Where we have this scene and also the final choral variation, which represents something almost dramatic, almost operatic. And this, I think, highlights the hybridized nature of form that Delius was exploring, so that Apalachia is a variation work, it's an orchestral work, it's a choral work. There's also an element of drama in it as well. So you put all of those things together, and Delius is beginning to show his extraordinary originality as a composer in formal terms. And of course, the other tonal elements of the work are extremely interesting too. Now, Apalachia really, I think, starts to make Delius's name, largely, of course, in Germany to start with. And then, of course, he also discovers Walt Whitman's verse. And of course, this is possibly from his experiences in America. Delius then, of course, discovers this wonderful poem from Out of the Cradle, Endlessly Rocking, about this boy who is becoming a man and anthropomorphically identifies with the male bird, the male mockingbird, as he pines for the she-bird who doesn't come back. And remember, these two birds mate for life. And he identifies with the male bird as he pines remorselessly. The marvellous thing about Seadrift, not just that it's in some ways a kind of opera manqué, it's a dramatic work, but of course it involves the chorus at various points commenting on the drama. The work, I think, is very interesting as a rondo form. The C is an important dramatic constituent. And this idea that occurs at the beginning in E major constantly recurs in that key at various strategic points in the work. And I talk about this at some length in my book, about how important Seadrift is and how clearly Delius was thinking about these formal elements as a cohesive element of his composition. That gentle rolling of the waves and Delius's sensuous harmony sets up the piece, and that rolling wave motif comes back at important moments. But in addition to the soloist, who is, who represents the boy who's becoming a man, we also have another side of Delius, which I think is important as reflecting this preoccupation with rich harmony. And that, of course, is the part song element. Delius, I think, was always interested in part song. It goes back to the time when he heard this improvised harmony in America with the Negro singers, and we can see it in the prominent choruses, which play an important part in all his operas. And we can see it here in each of the part songs that punctuate the structure of Seadrift. I mean, this one, for example, O Rising Stars, which is the nocturnal lament, which comes, of course, as the man begins to realise that the she-bird isn't coming back and that he has to reconcile himself to this tragedy. This is, I think, one of the most powerful parts of the work. O Rising Stars, perhaps the one I want so much. An example of Delius writing in an idiom of 8-part harmony for chorus. And of course this is something he would explore again and again. He would explore it in the Mass of Life, he would explore it in the very late Songs of Farewell, in the Requiem, and also in perhaps the part songs, the apex of his part song interest in the central part of the Song of the High Hills. In the latter stages of the book, one of the things I'm very anxious to do is, of course, to talk at length about his most central choral work, A Mass of Life, in which Delius puts so much of his efforts. And like Appalachia, it's a highly hybridized work, full of large choruses. It's the one and only instance I know of Delius ever writing a fugue, and Delius's fugue is, like everything else he wrote, highly idiosyncratic and unconventional in terms of its structure, yet brilliantly thought out in terms of structure it nevertheless is. I'm also very keen to talk about one of Delius's most intimate works. Again, another work which features part song as well as solo song, and that is his settings of Ernest Dowson, perhaps one of the most poignant poets that expresses Weltschmerz at this period of fin de siècle, if I can mix my languages for a moment. At this point, however, I'm very keen to talk about Delius and his orchestral works, which don't rely on words as a constituent of structure and tonality. And I'm particularly keen to look at masterpieces such as In a Summer Garden, which Delius, of course, revised extensively. And in my book, I do talk about both versions. I think I'm very keen to do this because I think it shows just how self-critical Delius was as a composer. This probably doesn't occur to us very much, but Delius was an inveterate sketcher. He would sketch music many times, from pencil sketches through to pen sketches, through to drafts, then revision of drafts through to the final forms. Quite a number of these final scores, which he then sent to the publishers, the Stichvorlage, aren't with us anymore. But we can still see in the manuscripts that are with us in the British Library many of these sketches, some of which frankly only mean something to Delius himself. They're very difficult, I think, to decipher individually. But In a Summer Garden was one work which we do know in two versions. And it's very clear, I mean, the second version of the work functions much more satisfactorily than the earlier version. And it seems as though Delius was very sensitive to this question of form and shape, thematic recurrence, climax, the role of certain keys, and so on. In A Summer Garden itself, I think we can see just how symphonic Delius's mind was working in just the few ideas that begin the piece. And this second idea. Third idea, much more lyrical. And so on. It's an astonishing piece, In the Summer Garden. It shows Delius's musical prose at a phenomenal fluency. And his handling of individual motives, his handling of tonal climax and so on is superb. It's very typical, I think, of Delius's structural predilections to have the big tune in the middle. This is something, again, that he did, for example, in Dance Rhapsody No. 2, to have this big, languorous tune in the middle, which begins on the violas. It's a magnificent monothematic idea which develops from start to finish. It was the sort of thing he would later do, I think, in the cello sonata to a large extent. But here it's done with, of course, the most felicitous orchestration. One point that I'm very keen to make in the book too is that I think Delius is one of the most original orchestrators in British music, certainly of this period. Now, of course, we tend to think of great orchestrators like Edward Elgar, and of course, latterly people like E.J. Moran and so on, who were great orchestrators. But the thing about Delius isn't so much that it's examples of Straussian athleticism or constant kaleidoscopic changes of colour. It's the particular sounds, the particular densities, the particular sonorities that he's able to get, perhaps for writing for strings, perhaps collective instruments like, for example, the oboe, the cor anglais, and the bass oboe, and perhaps the sarrusophone, a rather unusual instrument that, not that many people used in their orchestrations. Delius was an extraordinarily original orchestrator, and I think he must have had, a bit like Ravel, these crystalline ears in the way that he's able to translate his sketches into these glistening and extraordinarily coherent orchestral sounds. Orchestral players are often reputed to say they find playing Delius not that interesting, but I'm not sure whether this is true or not, but there's no doubt there's something highly distinctive about the sounds of Delius orchestras, these use of little snatches for woodwind instruments, which of course are linked with Delius's love of nature, the sound of a passing bird or a song of some kind, or the wind soughing in the trees, which was to haunt the first of his North Country sketches. I also talk really about a rather more astringent side of Delius's style, which I think is signalled by his largest tone poem, A Song of the High Hills, which in some ways again reflects Delius's love of hybridization. After all, A Song of High Hills is in many ways a choral work. Its main feature is this wordless chorus that in some ways is playing a part within the orchestra. There's no text at all in the piece, and it features particularly prominently at the major climax of the work. But again, this is a coming together of those elements of part song, the 8-part choral writing that Delius loved so much, that almost modal harmony that I think he learnt from Grieg, and of course the extraordinary sound of the orchestra. Here's a well-known section from it. The penultimate chapter of my book really focuses on what is perhaps a conundrum in all of Delius's composition, in that he seems to have got particularly interested in the latter part of his career in writing chamber music and concerto. Two genres which you almost have thought wouldn't have really appealed to the kind of poetic inclinations that appeal to Delius, that we see in works like In a Summer Garden, in the operas and so on, and in some of the descriptive and highly nostalgic choral works. And yet Delius seems to have wanted to return to these forms. I don't know whether it was that he felt the need to express something perhaps more disciplined, but return to them he did, and of course he produced 3 violin sonatas altogether, a cello sonata, and then this range of concertos, the double concerto, the violin concerto, and the cello concerto from the early 1920s. In part, of course, I think it was excited by the need that he wanted to write for certain prominent performers, such as Albert Salmons, or the Harrison sisters, May Harrison, Beatrice Harrison, the cellist, who of course was at the heyday of her career, and so on. But of course, writing a concerto demands quite a different kind of structural discipline than it does from writing a tone poem. Yet Delius, I think, actually brought something really quite imaginative to this discussion about form and tonality, in that he seems to have found things like variation structure once again, an important discipline in which to cement these musical structures together. The double concerto, which of course he wrote for May and Beatrice Harrison, is really it's a one movement structure, and this was the sort of thing that Delius favoured. We can see that in the rather less successful piano concerto that he'd written in the late 1890s, and really had a rather checkered history in its various changes of garb, and Delius didn't really seem to think that highly of the work in his later life anyway. But the double concerto, for example, shows an array of different variation forms in the first movement, which are truly fascinating and highly complex. The second movement, on the other hand, again, reveals Delius the lyricist once again. And so much of the solo parts of Delius's concertos really are part of this effusive lyrical outpouring. This is what he saw as really the aesthetic of concerto writing, and we can see this in the second subject, of course, of the double concerto. I mean, that idea, of course, returns with tremendous impact in the final pages of the score, and we see some of Delius's most profound harmony, but thinking in this rather new discipline of concerto form. And concerto form was always a complex form in the classical period and the 19th century. Perhaps his most successful essay in concerto form, I think, was the violin concerto, which of course was written for Albert Salmons. And here I think we see, perhaps more than anything else, this was Delius's instrument, of course, the one which he'd learnt as a boy and through his teenage years. And so it was one that he perhaps understood better than any other. But it's again the nature of the concerto structure, which has both a first movement and a slow movement and a scherzo built within its largely one movement structure, that is so impressive, and I think warrants some analysis. I think the slow movement, once again, where Delius seems to really score, is this wonderful idea which is given to the soloist. This is Delius at his finest. Now, this particular mature lyrical outpouring, this lyrical effusion that Delius possessed, of course, we can see in some of the later pieces that he produced, Eventyr, a sort of meditation on Norwegian folk tales of Asbjørnsen and Møe. But we can also see it in the second violin sonata, which I think is arguably his best violin sonata. But of course then, as we know, Delius wanted to finish a number of works in the mid-1920s, which he simply couldn't physically do. And though he had help from Jelka, who I think in all of this story in some ways is the hero. I mean, she devoted so much of her time not just to helping him when he was physically well, and put up with all sorts of, bad behaviour from him in many ways. But clearly when he began to lose his physical faculties, she supported him, nursed him, helped him, and so on, and even, of course, tried her best to copy down the works for him. And she was able to do this with one or two of the works, like The Splendour Falls on Castle Walls, his part song setting of Tennyson. But then, of course, this really became too much, I think, and what really was needed was a critical hand to help the process of dictation and copying out, which came, I think, from the Angels in many ways, in terms of Eric Fenby's help. After all, this came from nowhere. The Deliuses were in no real financial position to be able to afford anybody professional that they would have to actually pay. And there was Fenby coming from Delius's former home area, Scarborough, in Yorkshire, and offering his time for nothing except board and lodging in Grey, isolated from all his friends, his contemporaries and so on. And of course, I think what Fenby did was an extraordinary act of self-sacrifice in many ways. But the thing that, of course, Fenby was able to do more than anyone was to bring his own incisive criticism to Delius's music. Now, the last chapter of my book deals very much with these late pieces that Fenby helped to bring to light, of works like A Poem of Life and Love, and the Third Violin Sonata, the Songs of Farewell. I think I'm particularly keen to show that actually what seems to have been at the very heart of the process was to actually concentrate Delius's thoughts. Obviously, the process of dictation actually took a long time, and though we can see something of this in Ken Russell's film based on Fenby's book, I think it was really quite hard going, and I think Fenby clearly showed such an affinity for Delius's style that he was almost able to predict Delius's thoughts in many of the ideas that eventually went down. And of course, one of perhaps the triumphs of this period, I think perhaps the best work to come out of this, was the condensing of the Poem of Life and Love into a Song of Summer. And this, of course, is a much shorter work than the original symphonic poem that Delius had originally penned in the early 1920s. And Fenby was able to bring the surgeon's knife to considerable parts of the score and to create, I think, a much more cogent sonata structure from these rather more incoherent thoughts. One, of course, from the Poem of Life and Love that really stands out is, of course, this idea. And so on, which, of course, does eventually become the main second subject of the piece. But also, Fenby was also able to bring other elements of Delius's thoughts, I think, more clearly into focus. I mean, this idea, for example. That particular idea actually had featured many years earlier in Coanga. But of course, then there was the folk song-like idea with its famous Scotch snap. And there again we can see so many elements of Delius's earlier style, the diatonic melody, touch of modality, and then of course the chromatic bass and harmonies above, all very much part of Delius's style. Here, I think, encapsulated beautifully. So, of course, Fenby was able to concentrate Delius's thinking, and in the famous part that, of course, we see represented in Ken Russell's film, Delius took part of that material to create the famous introduction to this piece. And that particular idea, of course, is taken from a cello idea later on, a cello counter melody. And then, of course, this idea further up is, of course, the same idea as we've just heard in a later form, and then, of course, is also taken from the second subject, originally from the poem of Life and Love. So, I mean, these things were brought together by Delius and Fenby in their working together, and the conditions must have been tough. And as we know, I mean, Fenby ended up with a nervous breakdown. He'd been away from all his friends and his colleagues for months and months at a time. And I think the pressures of working with Delius, which was never easy. I mean, Delius didn't like repetition. He's always said to have called out the names of the notes rather than the nature or the grammar or syntax of the chords. But one thing is absolutely clear: he completely understood the theoretical nature of these harmonies fully, whether or not he used terms like invertible counterpoint or augmented sixths and so on. And as we know, I mean, there had to be a meeting of minds with Fenby and Delius in terms of nomenclature, because Delius was used to using the English nomenclature and Delius was used to using the German one. So the book is, I think, a dense one. I think it merits, if you have a score of the particular Delius work, to consult it when I'm talking particularly in analytical terms about much of the musical material. There is nevertheless a biographical outline to the book, so that one can follow through teleologically the nature of Delius's life and the circumstances that seem to have affected the production of works at any given time. And of course, the story, as we know, of Delius's life is highly individual, highly idiosyncratic, and it's like unlike any other life I think I know in British music in many ways. And of course, then he ended up dying in France in 1934, yet buried in Surrey at Limpsfield, and his wife buried next to him in 1935. So it's a curious element of perhaps repatriating Delius the Englishman, and yet, of course, I think what I hope will be evident from the book is that we're dealing with an artist who is highly cosmopolitan, who exists outside the mainstream in many ways, and yet, if we compare Delius's music at certain times in his career, particularly around A Mass of Life, or some of the symphonic poems like Appalachia and Paris and so on, we can see Delius really very much within the mainstream of European modernism. And it's all of these things that I want to bring together in the book, which I hope is reflected in the title of it, The Music of Frederick Delius, Style, Form and Ethos.